In a few of the prior videos, I sort of snuck in some variables, but I didn't properly introduce you to variables in Elixir, so let's take a moment to do that. Here's an Elixir list that contains strings representing a few political parties. Now the question is, what's the proper and conventional way of creating a variable that points to this list? In many languages, creating variables involves some sort of keyword, like var, let, or const, and depending on the language's type system, you might need to add some additional type information. But in Elixir, you don't need to add any of these types of descriptive identifiers. You just use a properly formed variable identifier like this. So the next question is, what represents a properly formed identifier for use as variables? Well, variables start with a lowercase letter and can be followed by 0 or more other letters and numbers. And sometimes, on the end, you'll find a question mark or an exclamation point. Now, all the letters after the initial letter can either be lower or uppercase. But when we're talking about variables, the convention in Elixir is to use all lowercase letters. But what if I wanted to change this variable parties to be a little bit more descriptive? So I make it political parties. A lot of languages would use camel case to make this a bit more readable, but as I mentioned a moment ago, the convention in Elixir is to use all lowercase letters, so to improve readability while only using lowercase letters, you'd typically separate words with an underscore. Syntax in this format is called snake case. This underscore is also sometimes used as the first character of a variable, and when you do this, it has a special meaning to you, the reader of the code, and the Elixir compiler will treat these variables a bit differently as well. So what is the special meaning of this leading underscore? Well, if you see a leading underscore like this, you can interpret it as an acknowledgement that a value like this exists, but there's no intention to use this variable. That probably seems weird to you, especially in this example, but rest assured you'll see plenty of good examples of the leading underscore and how it's helpful as you learn more about Elixir. I've got a question for you. Do you think this is a valid use of a variable? In other words, do you think I can use this name variable to point to the string will, and then maybe on the next line or a few lines down, I use it again with the string Kristen? I bet those of you who are more familiar with functional programming and immutable data would probably say, no, this isn't valid. Saying no would be a reasonable guess, as most functional programming languages wouldn't allow this, and if you're thinking about immutable data, doing this might seem like we're mutating data. So a good educated guess would be no, this shouldn't be valid. Let's try it in IEX. So I'll key in the variable name, and I'll bind it to the string will. Then on the next line, I'll key in the variable name again, and I'll bind it to the string Kristen. It seemed to work. We didn't get an error. So how's this possible? Isn't this mutating data? Well, is anything actually getting mutated? Think about the data in this example. There's two pieces of data, the string will and the string Kristen. Did either one of these strings ever get mutated? Nope. The only thing that changes is that the variable name was originally bound to one piece of immutable data, will. Then it was rebound to another piece of immutable data, the string Kristen. So we didn't break any immutability rules, but still it might seem weird to you if you've used another functional programming language. This ability to rebind variables to values is a bit controversial, and if you're experienced in functional programming, it might bother you, but try not to get too hung up on it. In practice, I don't think you'll find it problematic at all. By the way, one way of classifying a programming language is by how it handles types. In other words, is it a statically typed language, or is it a dynamically typed language? Dynamic typing means the data types of the values you use in your program are determined at runtime, whereas static typing means the data types are determined at compile time. If you had to guess, do you think Elixir is statically typed or dynamically typed. I've mentioned a few times already that Elixir is a compiled language. It's compiled into bytecode that can run on the Beam virtual machine. Well, since Elixir is compiled, you might be inclined to think that Elixir is statically typed because static typing is a compile time thing. This would be a reasonable guess, but it's the wrong answer. Even though Elixir is compiled, it's a dynamically typed language. Compilers can have many responsibilities, such as transforming source code to machine code or some other intermediate language, static analysis to check for bugs based on how you use your data types, and also, compilers often provide helpful feedback to developers if your code does something that's problematic. Well, Elixir's compiler does the first item, and it also does the last item to some extent, but it doesn't do static analysis. Now, there are ways to perform static analysis in Elixir, but it requires adding special type annotations to your source code and then running your code through an Erlang tool called Dialyzer. But keep in mind, this is totally optional. There's another way of classifying programming languages, which is either calling it a strongly typed or a weakly typed language. This particular way of classifying programming languages isn't great because there isn't an agreed upon definition of what strongly typed and weakly typed means. But even though there isn't a precise agreed upon definition of what these terms mean, I think there's still some value in using these terms. Here's a general and imprecise definition I'll use for strong and weak typing. A strongly typed system requires more discipline in how you use and operate on types. A weakly typed system requires less discipline and has looser rules. Here's an example of how I generally think about the distinction between these two definitions. Here's an expression where we've got two different data types, a string and an integer, and we're using the plus operator on both of them. So what should happen with this expression? Usually when we think about operators, like the plus sign, we're thinking about using it on like types. In other words, using it on two numbers, or using it on two strings. Some people would argue that this is invalid and should throw an error, and some people would say, it's fine. Just turn the 3 into a string and do string concatenation, or turn the 6 into a number and do addition. My point here is, a strongly typed system generally would say, you need to be more disciplined in how you use the plus operator, and it would say this expression isn't valid. So how is Elixir classified with regard to strong and weak typing? It's generally considered a strongly typed language. So in summary, it's a dynamically typed and strongly typed language. Okay, let's circle back to variables again. There is more to know about variables in Elixir, such as the scope of a variable and the different ways you can bind values to variables. In fact, there's a subtlety happening in this simple expression that's easily missed by the new Elixir programmer, and that's what we'll start talking about in the next video.